In today's episode of the simulator series, we are going to be creating the double jump system. Now, as always, if you guys do enjoy the video or it does help you out, make sure you smash the like button, also the subscribe button, and turn post notifications on if you want to get notified when I upload more Roblox development content. Additionally, I have a Patreon if you guys like to support me and you get access to all the scripts and the game file that I make during this episode. There's a link down below in the description, and you guys can go and check that out. With that being said, let's get right into it. So, hopping directly in the studio, the first thing we're going to do is go inside of the starter player, and when we click on the service, we can see that it has a couple of different properties, and the one that we want to actually search for is jump, and then we'll see the character jump height property and the character use jump power property as well. Now basically, when it comes to players jumping in Roblox, there are two different properties that can sort of affect how high they're jumping. One of those is the character jump height, and then if you have this property character use jump power enabled, instead of using the character jump height property, the character will actually start using the character jump power property instead. And we can see that whenever we select use jump power, that the jump height property is no longer shown and the jump power property is shown instead. Now, the character jump height property is basically how high the player can jump in terms of studs, whereas the jump power property determines how much upwards force is applied to the humanoid when jumping. Now, I'll be 100% honest with you, I'm not 100% sure the difference between the two properties or if there's any significant difference between the two properties. It seems like they're pretty much the exact same, but just sort of different units of measurement, and I'm just getting all of my information directly from the Roblox documentation. But anyways, the difference between jump power and jump height isn't super significant for this video. The most important thing is that you set the character use jump power to enabled, and for the character jump power property, you want to set that to 50, which should be the default number. Now that we've done that, we're going to go inside of the starter player, inside of the starter player script, and we're going to create a brand new local script, and we're going to rename this to jumping. Now inside of here, we of course want to make a couple of variables. The first variable we're going to create is players, and that's going to be equal to the player service. On top of that, we also want to get the user input service, so let's go ahead and create a variable for that, and then we also want to get the replicated storage service as well, just like that. Then a little bit further down, we're going to create a variable for the remotes, and that's of course going to be equal to the replicated storage.remotes. We also want to create a variable for the player, and that's going to be equal to the players.localPlayer. We'll also create a variable for the character, which won't be equal to anything yet, and we'll also create a variable for the humanoid, which is of course going to be the humanoid inside of the character, and we're actually going to type assert this variable, and this is going to actually be equal to a humanoid, just like that. The reason that we're asserting this variable to be the type of a humanoid is because it makes it easier to work with while we're scripting. Next, we're going to create a couple of variables. The first one's going to be used jumps, and that's going to be equal to 0. The next variable is going to be max jumps, and that's going to be equal to 2 for right now. And then we're also going to create a variable called can jump, and that's going to be equal to false. Now you might be thinking, how do we know when the player actually wants to jump? Considering we have the user input service, we could listen for specific inputs. So for instance, whenever the player presses the spacebar, but luckily the user input service actually comes with a really useful event. So we're going to say user input service dot jump request, and then we're going to connect that, but we don't have anything to connect that to yet. But this event is fired every single time the player wants to jump, no matter what platform they're on. So this event makes our scripting much easier. Anyways, we're going to leave that down there for right now, and then we're going to create a brand new function called character added. And what that's going to do is it's going to accept a brand new character, and we don't have to add the type to it, but we are going to anyway, and that's going to be of course of the type model. Now what this function is going to do is it's basically going to update all the variables. So for instance, the character variable is then going to be equal to the new character. The humanoid is going to be equal to the character wait for child humanoid. Used jumps is going to be equal to 0 because this is basically resetting all the variables because the player sort of just respawned most likely. And we also want to set can jump to false as well. Now that we've set all those variables, we can actually use the humanoid variable and we can listen to the state changed event, and we're going to connect that to an anonymous function. This function is going to accept the old state and the new state. Now we're going to check if the new state is equal to enum.humanoid state type.landed. So this means that the player actually just landed. And if this is true, then we want to set can jump to false, and we want to set use jumps to 0 because basically the player just finished jumping. Now continuing with the state, we also need to check if the new state is equal to enum the humanoid state type dot freefall, then we want to do something. Now if the player's state is freefall, that means that they're either currently jumping or they've jumped and they're starting to fall downwards. So what we then want to do is we want to say task.wait 0.2, and then we want to say can jump equals true. The reason that we're waiting 0.2 seconds is because we want to add a slight delay between players' jumps. So for instance, if we didn't have this task.wait and a player pressed the spacebar rapidly, they might use all their jumps up way too quickly, and it might make their experience a little bit worse. So that's why we're using using the test.wait just to make the system seem a little bit nicer. So now we're pretty much done with this function, but we now of course need to call this function. So then what we're going to do is below where we created this function and above the user input service.jump request, we're going to say if player.character then, and we're going to call the character added function and pass through the player.character just like that. The reason that we're creating this if statement is because when the player first joins the game, this if statement is most likely always going to return true. So then this function will be called and all the variables will be set up. Now, additionally, using our player object, we can listen to the character added event and we can connect that to the character added function as well. Now, because we're listening to this character added event, you might be thinking, is this part of the script still necessary? And unfortunately, yes, it is still necessary. When a player first joins the Roblox game, usually the character added event is not fired for that player. I believe because the character is added before all the scripts and things like that start to load. So this event is basically fired before all the scripts are even able to begin listening to it. So that's why we need to have this if statement so that when the player first joins the game, this function will still be called. Okay, so now that we've got all that, what we're then going to do is we're going to create a new function, and this is going to be called jump. Now inside of here, we're going to say if not can jump, then return end. So if the player is unable to jump, then we just want to stop the function right there. We also want to check if use jumps is greater than or equal to max jumps. And if that's true, then we also want to return end and stop the script right there. Otherwise, what we're going to do is we're going to use the humanoid and we're going to change its state and we're going to set its state to enum.humanoid_state_type.jumping. That will make the player's character jump. Then we're going to say use jumps plus equals 1. So we're going to add 1 to the use jumps. And then we're going to say can jump equals false. The reason that we're saying can jump equals false is because we're basically enacting the cooldown. So after we use this jump, most likely 0.2 seconds later, we will be able to jump again, as long as we didn't use up all of our jumps already. Okay, so now that we have that function created, we also want to make sure that we point the jump request event that we sort of started listening to but haven't connected it, and we want to make sure that we connect that to the jump function just like that. Okay, so now we should be able to go into our game and test this out. And now when we hop into our game, if we press the spacebar, we can see we are jumping, and if we press it again, we can actually see that we are able to double jump, and it seems like our double jumping system is working, so that's great. Now, like most of our other local scripts, this script is going to require some data from the server, and the data that's going to require is the amount of jumps a player has or is able to do. So for instance, we set the max jumps to 2 by default up here, but at the bottom of our script, we want to say max jumps equals remotes.getData invoke server, and then we're going to pass through jumps. Now, of course, we haven't actually added the jumps data to the player yet, so this won't actually return anything, but we're going to do that shortly. So we're sort of done with this script for right now. What we then want to do is we want to actually create the jumps config. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the configs folder, and we're going to create a brand new module script, and we're going to rename this to jumps. I'll also rename the module inside of here as well to jumps just like that. Then inside of here, we want to create a variable, which is going to be called config. That's going to be equal to a table. And now inside of this table, for the keys, we're actually going to be using the amount of extra jumps the player has, and the value is going to be how much that specific jump cost from the jump shop, which we're going to eventually create as well. So for instance, we're going to say 1 is equal to 0, and the reason that we're saying 0 is because we want the player to have 1 double jump by default. So when the player joins our game for the first time, we want them to be able to jump at least 2 times. So then for 2, we're going to set the price of that to 150,000, and then for 3, we'll set the price of this to 12 million, just like that. So now that we've got that created, we then want to also add the player data. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the player data folder, and inside of the template module script. Inside of here, it's actually really simple. All we have to do is go underneath of the rebirth buttons, add a comma to that, and then say jumps equals 1, just like that. The reason that we're saying jumps equals 1 is because we're basically going to be telling the server and the client that the player has 1 extra jump unlocked by default, and that'll enable them to be able to double jump. We can then close this template because we're pretty much done with that. The next thing we want to do is actually start creating the jumps shop server logic so that we can unlock more jumps. So what we're going to do is we're going to go inside of the server script service, and inside of here, we're going to add a brand new module script, and we're going to rename this to jumps shop, just like that. And then we'll also rename the module inside of here. There we go. Now that we have this created, we also want to create a remote event as well. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the remotes folder, and we're going to add a brand new remote event, and we're going to rename this remote event to purchase jump. And there we go. Now, of course, inside of this module script, we're going to need to get a couple of variables. So we, of course, want to get the player service. In addition to that, we also want to get the replicated storage and the server script service as well, just like that. And then, of course, let's go ahead and create a remotes variable like we do every single time. So replicated storage.remotes. Then we also want to create a variable for the player data manager, and that's going to be equal to require server script service.player data.manager. And we also want to create a variable for the jumps config, and that's going to be equal to require replicated storage.configs jumps, and there we go. Then inside of this module, we're going to create a brand new function. So we're going to say jumps shop dot purchase jump, and what that's going to accept is the player. And then we can also call this function as well. So we want to listen to the brand new remote that we just created, which is called purchase jump. We're going to say on server event connect, and we're going to connect that to the jump shop dot purchase jump function, just like that, which is going to be called profile. That's of course going to be equal to the player data manager dot profiles, and we're going to index that with the player. If we're not able to find the profile, then we just want to return end, stop the script right there. Otherwise, what we want to do is we want to create a variable called next jump, and that's going to be equal to the profile dot data dot jumps plus 1. We then want to also create a variable called next jump price, and that's going to be equal to the jumps config, and we're going to index that with the next jump. And then we're also going to create another variable called can afford, and that's going to be equal to profile dot data dot clicks is greater than or equal to next jump price. So if the player has enough or more clicks to purchase that, then what we want to do is if the player cannot afford that, then we're going to return cannot afford, and then we're going to include the price in this message just like that, and we want to make sure that we say end, so there we go. Also, for when we return up here, we can just say profile not found exclamation mark. And if this seems familiar to you guys at all, it's really similar to how we did the rebirth system in the last episode. When we're returning, we also include strings in the returns, because while we work and debug this system, we are going to be calling this specific function using commands, so we want to return a specific string through there so that we can actually see what's going on in our function really easily. Anyways, if the player is able to afford it, what we then want to do is we want to say player data manager dot adjust clicks, pass through the player, and we want to subtract the next jump price from the amount of clicks that the player currently has. We then also want to adjust the profile dot data dot jumps property, and we're going to set that equal to next jump just like that. And then we also want to make sure that we fire the purchase jump remote. So we're going to say fire client, we're going to pass through the player and the profile dot data dot jumps so that we let the player know the brand new jump that they currently have purchased. Finally, we want to return jump purchased exclamation mark so that we know that the jump has been purchased successfully. Okay, so now that we've done that, what we can do is we can actually go back to our local script, and towards the bottom of the script, what we're going to do is we're going to say remotes.purchaseJump.onClientEvent connect function. The argument is going to be jump, which is the amount of jumps that the player currently has, and then we're going to set max jumps equal to jump, just like that. So now whenever a player purchases a brand new jump, the server will notify the client, and then the client will update this variable and be able to jump an extra time. So now what we're going to do is we're actually going to create a command for debugging the jump shop system to see if we're able to purchase more jumps. So we're going to go inside of the server script service, inside of the CMDR folder, inside of the commands. We're going to duplicate the debug reburst module script, and we're going to rename that from debug reburst to debug jumps. Then we're going to go inside of that module script. We of course need to rename the command, so we're going to say debug jumps, and the alias is going to be DJ, just like that. For the description, we're just going to say debug jumps. We also don't need any arguments, so there we go. We can just remove that. And yeah, this module script does look pretty weird without any arguments, I'm not going to lie. Anyway, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to duplicate the debug reburst server script, and then we're going to rename that from debug reburst to debug jumps server, just like that. And we're going to open that script up, and for the amount argument, we can of course delete that because we're not going to have any extra arguments, so we can delete it just like that. Now, we no longer need the rebirth module. What we actually need instead is the jumps shop modules, so we'll also rename the variable as well. Then for the function itself, we're going to keep the player equals context.executor, and all we're going to do is we're just going to return jumps shop.purchase jump pass through the player, and there we go. That command is all set up. So now we can actually go inside of our game and test this out. Okay, so when we first get into our game, if we jump, we are only able to jump 2 times currently. Now, if we use the command, we can say debug jumps, and if we use the command, oh, looks like I made a slight mistake. So going back to the jump shop module script inside of the server script service, when we create the next jump price variable, we say jumps config and index that with the next jump. What we actually have to do is we say jumps config dot config, and then we index that with the next jump, just like that. So simple little mistake, just make sure you add dot config to jumps config right there, and you'll be all good. Then we can start it up and test it out. So now trying to use the command debug jumps, we can see that we're unable to afford it, so that's actually good. What we can then do is we can say adjust player clicks, and we'll set our balance to 175,000. Then we're going to run the debug jumps command again, and we can see it says jump purchased. So now when we jump, we're actually able to jump 3 times, which means that this is working perfectly. Let's try to run this command again. We can see that we now need 12 million. So I'm just going to give myself a lot of money, and then we're going to try to purchase the next jump purchase. So now we should be able to jump 4 times. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that is working perfectly. Awesome. Okay, so we can start closing a bunch of tabs. We can close the command tabs because we're pretty much completely done with that, and I'm pretty sure we're done with the jump shop and the jumps config as well. I think all we need still open is the jumping local script, so we'll also close those in the Explorer as well, just like that. There we go. The next thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to go inside of the Start GUI, add a brand new screen GUI, rename this to jumps, and inside of here we're going to add a brand new frame. Of course, for the sizing of this frame, we want to make sure that it is scaled, so we're going to set something like that. For the positioning, we want to make sure that we set the X anchor point to 0.5, and I don't really care about the Y too much, but that's good. For the position, we want to make sure that it's centered in the middle, so 0.5 on the X. For the Y, I think we could set it to about 0.75 for the anchor point and 0.75 for the position. Now, for the sizing, I think on the X, we can try about 0.4, maybe a little bit smaller, so like 0.375. That's a little bit better, I'd say. And for the Y, I think 0.1 is perfectly fine. I don't think we need to increase or decrease it at all. Anyway, inside of this frame, we're going to add a brand new text label, and we're going to rename that to jumps. Now, what this text label is actually going to say is double jumps, semicolon, and then the amount of jumps that the player has. So we're going to say 100 out of 100 for right now. For the text color, it's going to be white. For the font, we're going to set that to Gotham, bold, just like that. For the background color, we want to set that to 1. For the frame, we also want to set the background color to 1 as well, because we don't want there to be any background. For the size of the text label, we're going to set that to 1010. There we go. And we also want to make sure that the text is scaled just like that. Now, if we go to the test tab and click on the device, we can see how this looks on other devices, and it looks fine, so that's good. Now, we're pretty much done with that GUI. I think the last thing that we want to do is maybe just set the enable to false so that we no longer see it, and then we want to go back inside of the jumping local script. Now, inside of here, we're going to go towards the top of the script, and we also need to create a variable for the tween service because we're going to be using that. We also want to create a variable for the player's GUI, so we're going to say local player GUI equals player.player GUI, and then we also want to start creating variables for this specific GUI. So we're going to say local GUI equals player GUI, wait for child, jumps, and then we want to create a variable for the jumps label, and that's going to be equal to GUI.frame.jumps. And then towards the bottom of our variables, we're also going to create a brand new variable, and that's going to be a constant variable called jump text template, and that's going to be equal to a string, and this string is going to say double jumps, semicolon, amount / max, just like that. Now, inside of our jump function, when the player actually jumps, we want to modify the GUI a little bit. So the first thing we want to do is we want to actually enable the GUI. Then for the jumps label, we want to set the text transparency equal to 0. For the text color 3, we want that equal to color.fromRGB 255 255 255, so that makes the text white. And then for the jump label.text, we want to set that equal to jump text template semicolon G sub, and we want to replace the word amount with max jumps minus used jumps, and then we also want to call G sub on that method as well, and we want to replace the word max with max jumps, just like that. Now you might be wondering, why are we changing the text transparency and the text color 3? The reason for that is because basically when the player is no longer jumping and when the player hits the ground, this jumps GUI is supposed to sort of fade out a little bit and then become completely invisible, and when we go through that process, we adjust the text color and the text transparency, so that's why we need to update it here. Now that we've done that, below our jump text template variable, we want to create another variable called tween, and that's going to be equal to the tween service create, and we want to pass through the jumps label, and then we're just going to say tweeninfo.new. We're going to say 0.5 for how long this tween should take, and then for the properties, we want to pass through a table, and we're going to say text transparency equals 1. And by setting the text transparency to 1, that will make the label basically become invisible. Now below this variable, we want to say tween.completed, and we want to connect that to an anonymous function, and all we're going to do is once this tween is complete, we want to set the GUI to no longer be enabled, just like that. Now that we've created that tween, we actually have to call it. And when do we want to call it? Well, we actually want to call it whenever the new state is equal to landed, because that means that the player just landed on the ground, and we're resetting the use jumps variable and everything else like that. So this is when we'll call tween play, just like that. Then there's also one more thing that we want to do, and right here where we check if the use jumps is greater than or equal to the max jumps, before we return, we actually want to do something, and what we want to do is we want to set the GUI.enabled equals true. We then want to set the jumps text transparency to 0, and we also want to modify the text color 3 as well, but instead of setting it to white, we actually want to set it to red, so we're going to say 255, 0, 0, and now that will make it red. And then once we've done that, we also want to call the tween play, just like that. Now what this will do is basically when the player has used up all their jumps and is no longer able to jump, but they still are trying to jump, it'll make the label become red, and then it'll slowly make the label disappear as well. So now we can go into our game and test this all out. So now when we jump for the first time, nothing pops up, which is fine, but when we double jump, we can see double jumps pops up, and then when we hit the ground, it slowly fades away, so that looks pretty good. Additionally, when we jump and then try to jump again, but we're unable to, we can see that that turns red and then slowly disappears as well, which is working good. I ran the debug jumps command so that I can give myself an extra jump. Now let's jump again, and now we can see that this is still working perfectly as well. So when we use our first double jump, it says 1 out of 2, then it goes to 0 out of 2, and that is all working perfectly, which is really nice. Now there's one more thing that we can do, and that's modifying the player's jump power and walk speed when they jump. The reason that we might do this is because it seems like in in the normal clicking simulator, when the player jumps, their speed is increased and they're able to move around a lot faster. And it also seems like their jump height might increase as well compared to the first jump. So pretty much all jumps after the first jump have more jump power, it seems like, but I'm not 100% sure. And of course, because this is something so simple, once I explain it and show you how we're going to do it, you can easily change it to fit your own system. So towards the top of the script, we're going to create some more static variables. The first one is going to be called default jump power, and that's going to be equal to 50. Then we're going to create default walk speed, and that's going to be equal to 16. Then we'll create another variable called jump power, which is not the best name, but that's going to be equal to 100. And then we're also going to create jump walk speed, which is going to be equal to 50. Like I said, you can modify these variables however you want to. Anyways, we want to come down to the character added function. And now before we actually play the tween, when the player lands, what we want to do is we want to set the humanoid.jump power, and we want to set that equal to the default jump power. And we also want to do the exact same thing, but for the walk speed. So we're going to say default walk speed. There we go. Then we want to come up to the jump function, and when we change the humanoid state, we also want to change the humanoid's jump power to the jump power, and we also want to change the humanoid.walk speed to the jump walk speed, just like that. So now we can go ahead and start up our game. We can see that we jump a lot higher, and we move a lot faster as well while in the air, which is pretty cool. Now also one more thing to pretty much make this a perfect system. Inside of the jump function, right before we enable the GUI, what we want to do is we want to call tween, and then on here we want to actually cancel it. The reason that we're canceling it is because if a tween is in progress and we just set the GUI to enabled, then the text transparency of the text label could still appear invisible. And even though we set the text transparency to 0 up here, if the tween is playing and we don't cancel it, the text transparency would still be moving to 1. So setting the text transparency right here could basically be overridden by the tween service already, and that's why we're canceling it right before we enable the GUI so that the jump label appears perfectly. So ladies and gentlemen, with that being said, you now have a working double jumping system in your game. If you guys did enjoy or the video did help you out, make sure you smash the like button, also hit the subscribe button, and turn post notifications on if you want to get notified when I upload more Roblox development content. Of course, I have a Patreon if you guys like to support me and gain access to all the scripts and the game file that I made during this episode. There's a link down below in the description, and you guys are going to check that out. With that being said, I'll see you guys in the next episode.